Hello. All right. So I have Sarah Sato. I have Alexandria Cervantes. All right. So I have the two of you so far. So welcome, ladies. We're going to go ahead and we're going to go through the test. Okay. So hopefully you guys didn't have too much trouble with the video questions on the War of 1812. It obviously wasn't argumentative. So it was just kind of just factual and kind of straight up. And but I'll make sure that we hit that which is relevant to your second test. So notice, right, we have the 16th last night. The War of 1812 assignment was due, and then you have 5 days. You have until the night of the 21st to do this second test, which should be open and available right now. All right, and then after that, you'll have about four more assignments, and you're already done with the semester. And so after that, you'll have the Antebellum West, or I'm sorry, after that you'll have Jackson, and then after Jackson's, that'll be another argumentative assignment, and then the Antebellum West, then the coming of the Civil War, and the Civil War itself and Reconstruction, and we're done. And then we have a test three. Now notice also on the quizzes, right? The order in which I do it is kind of it's not in line with a textbook. Um, uh, Jackson's time period kind of is, but the Antebellum West, they save that for chapter 13, and I do that before the coming of the Civil War. So chapter 13 quiz is actually going to be due amongst the three that are due on the 3rd of December. So remember, I have three that are due on the 3rd of December, three quizzes. And I will give you guys an announcement to make it clear which chapters are due on the 3rd, because it's not as I put out in that original announcement. I put chapters 8, 10, and 11, and that's not true. Chapter 13 is going to be a part of those three instead of 10 and 11. And so I'll try to make that clear. And also when you go on to quizzes, I try to make it clear in the parentheses when each quiz is due. And so I have chapter 13 already on there, and I have it in a parentheses in large print that it's due the 3rd of December rather than waiting until the 17th, doing the last couple. Okay. So like I said, I'll send out an announcement on that, and I'll try to be very clear, not only in the announcement, but also on the under quizzes section of Canvas, the due dates of each of them. Okay. So let's see here. I have Angeline as well. Okay, good. All right. So going into the test for this week, right? A lot of the answers you should be able to find in the handouts themselves. But if just to try to reiterate some of this stuff to help you out for this test, because remember on the tests, um, I'm thinking about offering. I used to do argumentative essay questions, and I'm thinking about posting those as an extra credit option, because I don't like, just on principle, because I allowed with so many of the quizzes to do retakes, etc. Right, and you could do multiple submissions and resubmit assignments. On the three tests, I like to stand my ground and let you just do it once and no retakes. So if you should do, a little poorly on one or a couple of them, keep your head up. They're only just, a couple 50-point assignments amongst many that you're doing. And I will also give you an extra credit opportunity should you decide to write on one of those topics that I'm going to post very soon. Okay. So with that in mind, you look at the first few, they're right out of the War for Independence handout. So context to the number one on the test is found in the introduction. So you're looking at, right, like a burgeoning, a growing population that was relevant to the War for Independence, whereby Brinkley has that same thesis, many historians do, that the population just blew up in the 1700s. and it started dispersing in different regions. And England had just won the French and Indian War against the French and her allies, and so England felt like the Whig administrations felt like they needed to gain a better hold of the colonies, that there were changes going on that they needed to adapt to bring about better royal control. And not to mention, for taxing purposes, they went like 13 million um, pounds into debt from this war. So they needed to try to get out of debt also and raise revenue in North America. So those are all seen to be you know relevant when people, because when you're an historian, right? Historians will they choose facts that they feel are relevant to whatever they're investigating, and these are often things that they investigate that they find almost universally to be relevant as context, as the surrounding situation to the war for independence. Also, political ambiguity as far as where the rights of English, as the rights of Englishmen stand, right? Let's see here. Also, tension over Native Americans with land. Great Britain was tired of fighting with the Native Americans, so they're going to try to keep their colonists out of certain regions because they knew from experience that American settlers were infiltrating into native lands and it was causing trouble. And wars are expensive, and so they're trying to have, not to mention lucrative fur trading deals with the natives, and so that was oftentimes seen as relevant as well. And then different events, right, that put stress on the British Kingdom, of course, at the top of that being the 7 Years War, known here as the French and Indian War. um, then the different interpretations. I need you to know the salutary neglect thesis, which is found in the textbook, right? That we were left alone, that the British did not enforce their mercantilist restrictions very effectively. And so we kind of smuggled and grew and produced what we wanted, traded what we wanted, didn't abide by the protocol of having to go to England first and get certain enumerated goods taxed first, could only sell certain commodities to England itself or to her colonies, and certainly not to the French or the French Caribbean. And we were defying those things. There's evidence for that. Paul Johnson is another big historian on this thesis. And then, of course, our assemblies started acquiring a lot of powers throughout the 16 and 1700s. And so it's likened to like a kid who's neglected by his dad, and his dad had very strict rules, but he never was around to enforce them. And so the child grows up and becomes self-sufficient and gains a sense of entitlement from being accustomed to being virtually independent. And then dad suddenly comes home when the kid's already full grown and says, okay, now I'm finally going to enforce the rules. And the son or daughter is like, I don't think so, dad, too little too late. And so that we fought to keep a good thing going. And that's oftentimes the English perspective of the American War for Independence to this day. uh, Remember, Bernard Bailyn's thesis is a very uh, um, excuse me, um, sorry if I cough a little, is a very romantic thesis, and that is it applies to like court history and the idea of American exceptionalism, that we're a special country, that we were not just simply born on ambition and desire for wealth and opportunities and for power and independence, but that we were founded on lofty principles, and those principles are found right in the Scottish Enlightenment. And this is a very crude uh, generalization. I'm simplifying it, but to a large extent, the Scottish Enlightenment was very libertarian, right? Little government, distrust of government, for individual rights, for checks and balances, for accountability of rulers, all right? And then the French Enlightenment. I remember that was really big on the social contract, people's permission uh, uh, for government to exist. The government is our servant and not our master, there to protect our natural rights, etc. And then Howard Zinn's thesis was really cynical, right? He thought that he saw like a class war erupting, And he's a Marxist historian, so he's looking for that. He's romanticizing that, right? As far as those from below fighting for their rights and fighting for equal economic opportunities. And so he sees uh, a class war in the making, and the founding fathers being caught in the middle. Because when you look at the founding fathers who were at the Constitutional Convention, they were not a mini example of their population. They were not a microcosm of America. Most Americans were not college educated, were certainly not attorneys, but most of the founding fathers were both of those. And so that the founding fathers, not wanting to be caught in a class war, they used the British as a convenient scapegoat, and they kind of hijacked the rebellion, took it over, and used propaganda, etc., to get the American people to fight against the British and kick them out, instead of the poor's ire, their anger, turning its ugly head toward them as a group. All right. The Great Awakening. Remember the Great Awakening, because we've talked about the Enlightenment. The Great Awakening was really big on conditional deference, right? Deference is obediently knowing your place and accepting your lot, accepting the superior position and authoritative position of your social betters. That's old school, right, in Western Civ and in world history for that matter, as an historical phenomenon. And with the Great Awakening, they said that if your leaders are not following God, then you should no longer show them deference. You have the right to rebel. To me, it kind of shows part of the seeds to modern notion of civil disobedience, right? Defying those in authority because you believe that they and their policies are in defiance of a higher law. All right, let's see here. We already did that. Number 7, Joseph Ellis on Washington, right? His depiction is somewhat revisionist, right? Found in the War for Independence handout, that there was a degree to which the founding fathers' ambitions, their selfish ambitions to get ahead in life, to get ahead in the British system, were somewhat thwarted by the British. And so that there was a degree to which there was a little bit of kind of sour grapes phenomenon going on as far as the motivation of some of the founding fathers, that some even go so far as to argue that had their ambitions not been thwarted, they may have been Tories and supported the British in the War for Independence instead of the rebellion. And remember, though, in fairness to Ellis and in fairness to Washington, it wasn't just so simplistic that Washington, he claims, couldn't get ahead and therefore he joined and led the rebellion, but also that he felt like there should be meritocracy. Those who are the best qualified, those who work hard and are the most talented ought to get the positions without artificial privileges given to certain groups of people and individuals just because of their family name and because of their royal connections, etc. So to Washington, right, he thought that the whole British system, laden with special clauses and perks for the nobleman, the whole idea of a nobility, was unfair and unnatural. All right, let's see here. And so we've kind of covered numbers 1 through 8. Number 9, Alan Brinkley, and I've already mentioned, right, you'll easily find in his introduction right away that he adheres to the salutary neglect thesis. And let's see here. Moving on to number 10, then you go for the argumentative assignment. I have both numbers on here as numbers 10 and 11 on the test from that assignment when we tried the Articles of Confederation, right? So the very standard popular interpretation is that we tried a very enlightened, very liberal, very decentralized, very democratic government under the Articles of Confederation, and that generation, for lack of a better articulation, they blew it. They behaved in the exact manner that ancient critics like Aristotle and Plato of democracy claimed people would behave, that they selfishly wanted access to credit and loans and access to lands, and that had harmful effects on their state governments. That having a confederation, the argument against the conservative argument against the confederation was that states would be jealous of one another and would vie and compete with one another, and there would be discord, there would be disagreements and disunity. That you need more of a centrally powerful government to force them to cooperate together. And so that when we tried this system, the people blew it. They behaved in exact selfish ways and immature and rash ways that critics of democracy and critics of a confederacy claimed people would behave. And so hence that it played right into the hands of the conservatives, who could tell the libertarian liberals of their time period, see, Aristotle and Plato were right about democratic government. See, people who wrote about the Scandinavian and the Italian confederacies and how messy they were, that they were right. And so hence it got just enough um, uh, approbation, approval from the liberals to not fight the Constitution as much as they may have had this not happened. And so, of course, with the Constitution, you saw looking at the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 alone, they ended up creating a much more centralized government in defiance of this confederation. And then also, you were able to see how the extent to which our republic initially was not that democratic. Only the House reps were properly elected of all the major sectors of the federal government, and even they were elected by those that the states decided were citizens, no universal citizenship, etc. So then with number 11, Pauline Myers' thesis, right? Pretty cynical of the founding fathers, right? That's number 2 on that assignment, and that's number 11 on the test. And she says that the founding fathers were not going to have the Bill of Rights, for instance, that they were not for having a very democratic republic, but that the people themselves insisted. They put pressure upon the founding fathers to kind of democratize the Constitution a little bit. And they did that mainly during the ratification process. 9 of the 13 states had to approve of this Constitution. And you see, especially in states like Massachusetts, where people came uninvited from their villages and towns and said, on behalf of my people of Braintree, Massachusetts, we are not okay with this Constitution unless there's a clause in there that guarantees freedom of expression and freedom of religion and freedom of the press, right? Like something like the future First Amendment. And so those demands from these uninvited guests to these ratification conventions that put enough pressure on the founding fathers to put in the Bill of Rights and other enlightened components to the Republic. Okay. And of course, so the type of government that we devised was a constitutional federal republic, right? Not a democracy. The type of economic system that we put in, these are 13 and 14 on test 2. The type of economic system that we inaugurated was capitalism, right? Free enterprise, private property, private economic transactions, etc., without government regulation or without government dictation, right? But it was not laissez-faire. Remember, laissez-faire is like let it be. Government completely stays out, because Adam Smith and his Wealth and Poverty of Nations, that's what he advocated, because the Enlightenment was all about natural laws. And he believed that the natural laws to human psychology, to pretty much, even though they didn't have the term yet, to sociology and to economics would do their thing. And the government need not intervene in the economy at all. We never did that. As you see during Washington's administration, Hamilton engaged in plenty of government intervention in the economy. So we have capitalism, but not laissez-faire. All right. The Federalist Papers were about 87 short essays that philosophically and historically try to defend us going to a less democratic, more centralized government, right? And so with the Federalist Papers, they were the conservatives' attempt to intellectually convince the liberals that we need a more centralized, less democratic government. All right. So those are the Federalist Papers. Um, Then I ask you on 16, which of the following was not an enlightened component to the Constitution? So through your Constitution assignment, you should be prepared for that. So the basics, right? Checks and balances, the Bill of Rights, the direct election by citizens of the states, of the House of Reps. Those are all enlightened components. As far as universal citizenship, no, we did not go that far, right? We allowed the states to decide. And so African Americans were disenfranchised, women were disenfranchised, Native Americans unwilling to assimilate were disenfranchised. Uh, Oftentimes in many states, even white men who did not own property were disenfranchised. At least parts of their citizenship rights, like voting, were taken away or deprived of them. All right, conservative elements of the Constitution, number 17, right? Senators not popularly elected, longer terms of 6 years as opposed to 2-year terms for the House reps. Article 1, Section 8 is argumentatively conservative, giving much more power to the central government than existed under the Confederation. Implicit acceptance of slavery is clearly a conservative element to the Constitution, right? So those are some examples of the Constitution being conservative. And then number 18, the argument by conservatives, right? As far as their elitism, is just remember the analogy that I gave you where I said, do you believe all human beings are entitled to the same rights and opportunities and basic protections under the law? That's in line with liberalism. That's in line with the Enlightenment, with the Scottish Enlightenment, etc., right? But do you believe that everyone is equally capable of writing you an English paper or fixing your car or playing a sport? No, right? The conservatives argued that nature or God is not necessarily fair in his allocation of talents and to people, that some people are more talented, more bright, etc., than others. And so hence they believed that that the politicians and the elected reps ought to be the cream of the crop, ought to be morally the best men, ought to be educated and prepared with leisure to be able to read things and to study and to cultivate their minds and broaden their horizons. And hence that was their kind of elitist view of government, right? The anti-federalists, later known as the Democratic Republicans, they were against too strong of a central government. They were initially against the Constitution for that reason, and they were mainly libertarian in their beliefs. And a lot of them, like Jefferson, ended up just kind of grudgingly acquiescent to the Constitution, never fully given it their public support for that reason. And number 20, right? What are some ways in which the the liberals were alarmed by Alexander Hamilton, in ways in which he appeared in his public perception to be his public image to be excessively conservative? You find that on number 1 of the early Republic Great Man History handout, right? And so you look at that, and then you look at the examples. Him relying heavily upon the wealthy through bond purchases to lend money to the government and wanting to deliberately owe them money because he felt like they would have a stake in society, they would have a stake in the republic and wanting it to survive, if for no other reason than the selfish reason of getting their money back. His Bank of the United States, nowhere in either of the first 3 articles are you going to find the right of the federal government to devise a federal bank. And they, especially when the Supreme Court okays it on the basis of the necessary and proper clause. The necessary and proper clause was scary to liberals, right? It seemed like a blank check to the government, to Congress in particular, to be able to do that which was not explicitly given to them as a right to do under Article 1, Section 8. And that's at the end of that list, right? And then the Whiskey Rebellion, the liberals thought that the Whiskey Rebels ought to be dealt with rather leniently on principle, right? Because the Declaration of Independence had stated that the people have the right to revolution. if they felt like the government was not receptive to their needs and was not protecting their natural rights. And they were being taxed by the Secretary of the Treasury rather than Congress. And so, it was already kind of constitutionally dubious. And so the way they cracked down, Hamilton and Washington, on the Whiskey Rebellion, that also alarmed liberals and argumentatively helped galvanize the liberals into forming an oppositional party, the Democratic Republicans. Later on, just the Democrats. All right, let's see here. George Washington, right? Just the manner by which he tried to play the middle. Remember, he was all about civic virtue, like Cicero and Tacitus of Rome, that you shouldn't favor one faction over another, right? A faction is a group that shares the same ideology and the same self-interest, but that you should do what's best for the collective welfare of Americans in general. But some people believed that his actions belied that he gave Hamilton too long of a leash to do these very conservative policies. All right. Um, let's see here. With uh, with 23, with the liberals, what he did try to do, right, is he made it clear during the Articles of Confederation, he relinquished his sword when the war was over. And because people with Julius Caesar and history and others, right, had used their war leading popularity to use that military muscle to defeat their political foes and become somewhat of tyrants. And so he allayed the fears of liberals and assuring them that he was under uh, non-military, under civilian rule, with the Articles of Confederation and the Constitutional Continental Congress. And so that helped kind of allay some of the fears of liberals. He ran for just 2 terms when he arguably could have won more than two. He quit after that. He engaged in goodwill tours. He engaged in uh, press conferences. He had his famous walks, his 2 o'clock walks, where he invited people to come and shake hands with him, meet him, ask him questions, etc. And he tolerated a hostile press. Of course, the First Amendment guaranteed that, but he still, being in a baby republic, could have defied that and could have cracked down on his opposition. The Aurora, in particular, was a newspaper that just tore into him as president and really infuriated him personally. But of course, he did nothing about it on principle and in support for the liberals and trying to play the middle. All right, moving on to 24, David McCullough with John Adams, and you find that as number 2 in the or early Republic Great Man History assignment. McCullough is somewhat of a court historian of John Adams, right? He supports him, he sympathizes with him. It basically states that John Adams was too independent-minded for politics, that in being independent-minded, he managed to alienate himself from both his own party on the right, the Federalists, and the Democratic Republicans on the left. And so hence that's why he became a one-term president and lost re-election to Jefferson. All right. The Alien and Sedition Acts obviously were constitutionally dubious. The Alien Act giving the president power to deport radical French revolutionaries who were establishing Jacobin clubs like Citizen Genet and other French radicals who came here and toured America and tried to get Americans to support the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Army and spreading the French Revolution by force in Europe. But the Constitution had given the right over naturalization of immigrants and immigration policy to Congress, and they gave that power to the president. And so that obviously was controversial for that reason, because the checks and balances were meant to be there for a reason, to hold everyone accountable in the federal government. And the Sedition Act, right, very much curtailed or cut short Americans' First Amendment rights. And especially when John Adams went after a famous editor who was after him, it very much looked like he was abusing his power as the chief executive, and in cutting short people's First Amendment rights. So anything that you expressed that was that supported sedition against or treason, rebellion against the government, and it even went so far as impugning the motives of government and its policies, like with the quasi war with France. You could be have your stuff confiscated, be fined, and even arrested. Let's see here. Number 26, Hofstadter's thesis of Jefferson and his democratic public persona. I find that's a fascinating book. It's called American Political Tradition by Richard Hofstadter. And on his thesis of Jefferson, right, his chapter about him, I call it the daddy thesis, right? Is that you guys have read it, hopefully, is that right? He felt a sense of wealth guilt because of the connections he had through his mother's Randolph family, and that he was trying to win the favor of his father, who was seen to be a commoner, Peter Jefferson, and try to convince himself and others, himself just as much as anybody, and his father, that he was not an aristocratic privileged brat, but that he was in touch with the people themselves, right? Let's see here. The Louisiana Purchase, you find this not only in the handout, but also in the textbook, the ironies involving that purchase. One, right, is remember Jefferson in his notes on the state of Virginia. Remember, that's when he had correspondence with a French friend, and he wrote very libertarian, very liberal beliefs to this gentleman against slavery, for the right of the people to prevail in a republic in their will, checks and balances, right? Limited government. People in government should not do that which was not expressly enumerated or stated that they can do in the Constitution. And so that ended up becoming published, his correspondence to this gentleman, and published in a book called Notes on the State of Virginia. So his rhetoric, what he preached, was pretty at times even radical. Again, in support of rebellions and being very lenient toward rebellions, etc. Him claiming that the will of the people ought to prevail as a lesser evil. Remember, he wasn't that far to the left in that he totally trusted the collective wisdom of the common people, but he thought that their mistakes made out of ignorance because of a lack of a public education system would be less detrimental to the republic than the deliberate bad decisions made by educated men who know exactly what they're doing, but are morally up to no good. So at any rate, he purchases the Louisiana Territory. When you read Article 2 of the Constitution, where does it say that the president can purchase foreign territory? It doesn't. But he did it anyway, right? And he got the Senate after the fact to approve it as a formal treaty and got around it that way. He sent expeditions to the West, right? And arguably, like with Meriwether Lewis, to me, he kind of symbolized Jefferson's intellectual curiosity as kind of a Renaissance man. He brought back information on the West. I mean, after all, right? Don't you want to know and learn about the territory that you're trying to purchase there in the far West? And so when he traveled, and remember, the Louisiana Territory was huge. It's certainly much bigger than the present state of Louisiana, right? If you see a map, I think I had a picture on there. It included at least about like 19 territories and states of the future. But at any rate, he sent Meriwether Lewis there, and he brought back information on flora and fauna, animal and plant life, the ecosystems there, the culture of the Native American tribes. Jefferson was curious about all that, right? But arguably, Meriwether's right-hand man, Clark, his diary and his interaction with the natives tended to suggest that there may have been a little bit of an imperialistic design in these expeditions, right? Remember, imperialism is intruding upon the sovereignty of other separate sovereign people and imposing your will on them. He literally would tell the Native Americans that he would often greet, greetings from your great white father, that kind of paternalism, right? And of course, the great white father, he said, was Thomas Jefferson, the president. and he would get numbers as far as how many warriors they had, if they were likely to be bought off with money or with certain commodities that they coveted, or if they likely were to become enemies, and how powerful they were as far as anticipating having to fight them to take that land over against their will. So a lot of contradictions with this guy Jefferson, right? After he became president. And so, and then also another contradiction, right, you find in the book is he did not initially give grant democratic government when he bought this territory. There were people that had lived under what he called the ancien regime, the old school governments before the Enlightenment, before the French Revolution, particularly the French and the Spanish citizens, because remember the Louisiana Territory had gone back and forth, being claimed by France and Spain. So he said they were not accustomed to self-government. Native Americans, of course, right? And so he claimed that they weren't ready for self-government. And then also he was afraid, when you look at a guy named Wilkinson and Aaron Burr and their alleged conspiracy to break off the Louisiana Territory from the United States, and even at times offer to sell it to the Spanish and to the Mexican government, that was scary to him, right? So he handpicked guys. I think it was like a board of like 21 men in the northern section and in the southern section to rule over those sections. And he said, well, they're territories now. And in time, when they become incorporated as states, then they can have self-government. So that was kind of ironic also, right? And so all those things might be relevant to number 27. Then with number 28, Jefferson was all about intellectual freedom and the idea, right? He said that even ideas that seem to be dangerous, that seem to be immoral, that seem to be irrational, they ought to be given their fair share in the free market of ideas. That he said that he trusted the wisdom of the people, and that when truth and error collide, as long as there's healthy, open debate and discourse on different topics, that the truth eventually will prevail, and it need not fear anything from poor or dangerous ideas. So he was all about open discourse between liberals and conservatives, right, and so forth. But when he became president, he didn't practice what he preached there either. Is he kind of used the spoil system. He put fellow Democratic Republicans in most of the cabinet positions. He surrounded himself arguably with yes men whose ideas and ideologies were in line with his own. And part of that also was that he was so non-confrontational that when people would debate in his presence, he couldn't handle too much confrontation, according to many historians like Hofstadter. And so he didn't like that, but his principles and what he had written before becoming president suggested that he would be for that, right? But he didn't. Let's see here. And then 29, another irony, right, is that he said one of the greatest usurpations, like an illegal grabbing of power that doesn't belong to you by an executive, is engaging in military engagements without congressional approval first. And remember, we made that clear in the Constitution, that it's the Congress that raises an army. It's the Congress that nationalizes the state militias. And it's the Congress that declares war. And then and only then the president becomes commander in chief during war of that national army. But in North Africa, right, the Tripolitan or the Barbary Coast Wars, he had the USS Philadelphia sent there to fight the Barbary pirates of Tripoli without congressional approval. He sent a guy named William Eaton to try to literally overthrow the Basha or governor of Tripoli. His name was Yusuf, by his brother Ahmed, because Yusuf was engaging in extortion and piracy, supporting his corsairs to stop people in the Mediterranean, force payments from them, and if they didn't, they would confiscate their stuff and sometimes even confiscate them and sell them in human trafficking system in Tripoli as well as Istanbul. So that's kind of ironic that Jefferson did those things without congressional approval, sometimes even without congressional knowledge. Um, let's see here. With number 30, another irony is Jefferson adhered to the racist belief of essentialism that certain demographics, certain people are different, are inherently biologically inferior to other groups. And one group that he tended to adhere to that was African Americans. He did not believe that they were innately as intelligent as WASP or white Euro Americans. Of course, it was ironic that he wrote that an example of the um, the unhealthy condition of slavery, he thought, was the fact that slaves will never be honest and truly free and open and be able to be so with their masters, right? Because their masters have this arbitrary power over them. They could sell them, they could sell their children and loved ones from them. They have all these bargaining chips to extort them, right? And he thought that what better example of the immorality of slavery than is when masters have sexual relations with their black women slaves. Because what is the black woman slave to do? Does she really have a choice? Can she really be honest and open with this white master? And it's ironic, right, that he fathered 4 children with Sally Hemings, one of his slaves, had an affair with her, and so lots of contradictions with this gentleman, right? And then when it became publicized, because there's evidence that when he took her to France, um, he lived in egalitarian, open fashion with her as his woman, because it was acceptable there in France at that time. They were progressive, they were ahead of their time in race relations. But when he came back here to the States, and when it became known as a quote scandal, his affair with her and their biracial children, he went back on his word to her and freeing all their children at 21, and acknowledging his union with her. So lots of contradictions with this guy, right? Let's see here. So going to number 31, Alan Brinkley. Does he state that he just became drunk with power and he changed? It became inherently more conservative as he aged? Does he claim that he was just a full front hypocrite? No, as you see in the textbook, right? He has a more sympathetic thesis, as he gives Jefferson more benefit of the doubt and contends that Jefferson was so non-confrontational, right, and personally as an individual, that he saw forces that he thought were too large for himself to contend with, forces that he could not take on. And so he capitulated, he surrendered, he gave in to those larger forces. And instead of being idealistic, right, not seeing the world as it is, but as it ought to be and wanting to improve the world, so often he appeared to be in his younger years, that as president, he became pragmatic. He became more practical and less idealistic, and just said, you know what, in this given situation, I believe my only viable options are A and B, and I'm going to go with A or I'm going to go with B because it's going to yield more practical results for the time being. So kind of choosing lesser evils in his own mind, right? So that tends to be Alan Brinkley's thesis, okay? Let's see here. Moving on to the last questions are on the War of 1812. So the 2 official reasons, according to the video, by which Madison asked Congress to declare war against Great Britain and her Native American allies was, 1, as you saw in the video, a violation of our international rights as a neutral nation to trade with both sides uh, during the Napoleonic Wars. It's not going to be codified until Geneva in the 1850s, I think it was, like during the Crimean War. But already there were conventions, London conventions and others. And it also, it kind of morphed from the Catholic Church and its laws when it had so much political power over Europe in the medieval time period. They began establishing notions of, it's called just war doctrine, right? Uh, and just war doctrine entail 2 categories. One is war should only be fought for the right reasons, for the causes of war to be just. And the second one was the manner by which war is fought ought to be just. And of course, right, one of the main, as you could guess, one of the main components to the second category was you leave non-combatants alone. People who are not officially at war, you leave them alone. And that included notions of neutral countries who are not a part of a war to be able to trade their commodities to either or both sides fighting, provided that they were not on a list, which they get the term contraband. You can't obviously sell guns to one of the warring sides. That you're clearly not being neutral. And so the commodities we were trying to ostensibly trade were not war materiel. It was cotton, clothing, and other commodities that were non-war related. And both sides, especially the English at this time, evidently, were infringing on those rights. They were stopping our merchant ships and taking their produce from them if they even suspected that we were trying to trade those commodities with the enemy, because they were trying to blockade each other and try to stifle the entry of goods and supplies into each other's countries, right? And to get them to submit that way through naval blockade tactics. So at any rate, that was one reason. And then the other one, right, was fomenting or stirring up war amongst our Native Americans in the Ohio Valley in particular, right? The Battle of Tippecanoe started everything off officially. And so, like Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet of the Shawnee tribe, they were trying to unite the Native American tribes, right? Because they were tired of American colonists intruding on their lands, and then there'd be atrocities on both sides. And the British promised them that they would guarantee their territorial integrity if they fought the Native Americans with the British instead of with us. So those who did, right, oftentimes put red ochre on their tomahawks. And so the political, actually not the political, the unofficial jargon of that time period called the Native Americans who sided against us red sticks. And so at any rate, that was the second reason, is that the British stirred up or provoked the red stick Native Americans to fight against us. All right. Um, the failed Canadian invasions, you should see that in the video. That 33 should be really easy. Okay. Let's see here. 34, I kind of already did, is a lot of the Red Sticks sided with the British for that reason, right? Is American encroachments upon their land by individual settlers. And it was kind of a vicious cycle, is when settlers would come in and they would get attacked, they would cry out to their state um, legislators or to their territorial governors and say, hey, what about the Fifth Amendment saying that our lives, liberty, and property ought to be protected by the government? And so then, with the knowledge of these atrocities, the federal government would send in strings of forts to just supposedly protect American citizens and settlers as they were coming in, and then the Native Americans would see those forts as as act of war, intrusion upon their land by military personnel. Um, of course. And so that would stir up fights with the soldiers, et cetera, et cetera. All right, let's see here. And then 35, um, according to the video, right, the fight against Native Americans in the American South was particularly kind of virulent, bitter, and so forth. In particular, the Creek tribe. Look up Horseshoe Bend, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. It was particularly ruthlessly fought by Andrew Jackson and his Tennessee volunteers against the Creek Red Sticks in the South, and the British trying to come in through Louisiana and take the lower Mississippi. So the fighting, and also the Seminole, the drama with the Seminole from Florida, lots of drama in the South. Okay, so I technically have gone through the test. Those are the 35 questions. They should be posted already. Um, you get one stab at it, so take your time and look at your argumentative assignments. Watch this video and take notes. Use your textbook. All right. So, are there any questions from anyone? All right, you sure? Okay, guys. And so you guys hang in there, okay? We're getting right through. You guys are moving very quickly, having just 5 days for each assignment. But that's all I have to say. I feel like you guys should be prepared in light of this video and in light of your assignments and textbook quizzes. You theoretically should be prepared to tackle this. And let's see here with my names. I want to make sure that I have everyone's name. So I have Sarah, Alexandria, Angeline. I see Ahisha. All right. Ahisha, your last name starts with an R, I see. So I should be able to find your last name. I want to give you extra credit. Am I missing anyone amongst in addition to you four? All right. Thank you, Ahisha. Have your last name now. Okay, so if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go for the week. Okay. So good luck on this. Then you will have due next Thursday the Andrew Jackson one, and I will post that very shortly. All right. And on Tuesday, next Tuesday, the 24th, I'll be here again and give a video on that assignment. All right, you guys. So you guys have a good week. Thank you for joining me. You'll get. I'll pad your test scores. Those of you who were here today. Okay. But you guys have a good week. Good luck with test number 2. And if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Okay. All right. All right. Have a good one.